care about current affairs, it's on the Oshow. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the Oshow. If you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the Oshow. It's the Oshow. Laura Babcock.
Welcome to the Oshow, Canada's current affairs show with strong opinions. I'm your host, Laura Babcock, and I want to thank all of you across Canada and around the world who are paying attention to what's happening on the podcast. As you know, we are bringing to you the latest and biggest issues that are affecting Canada and all of our communities. And so I appreciate if you subscribe on YouTube or you follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere else that you get the information, because it's only by having these conversations together that we're going to come up with some solutions. So today, something a little different is going to happen on the Oshow. We're going to take a deep dive into one topic, and that is the topic of homelessness. It's something that we are seeing increasingly around the world. There is mass migration happening because of wars, because of climate change, and we are seeing right here in Canada, hundreds of thousands of Canadians are experiencing homelessness every single night. And for many, it's becoming chronic homelessness, almost like an acceptable way to survive in our society. And if you've been in any community, especially in Ontario, but I know across this country, you can see tents, little encampments, little small communities. You hear stories about people who have full-time employment, nurses, people who are working jobs that otherwise could have allowed them to have maybe a small apartment, raise a family, now being rent-evicted because of policies. So we're going to get into a conversation on the back half of this special with Tara Groves-Taylor. She is the CEO of Community Healthcare in Kitchener-Waterloo. They are not only in one of the fastest growing communities in the entire country, but also they happen to have the largest refugee health center in the country. They are on the front lines of the homelessness crisis, and they are seeing it triple. So what are they doing about it? What do they recommend that the rest of us look at in terms of solutions and collaborations? It's going to be a fascinating discussion with the CEO who's on the front lines. But I want to start our program with a CEO who's got a famous title, and that is skidrow CEO. It's a title that raises some eyebrows, but the story behind it is a compelling one, and I think one that couldn't be more timely for us to listen to, whether we're in Canada or anywhere else in the world, where we are seeing people who are living rough, who are exposed to the elements, who we have to walk by and wonder how they're going to make it through the night. And I'm, of course, referring to Joe Roberts. He is the Skidrow CEO, famous for his own personal story, his rise to success, and then his decision. Yes, this was a decision he made to push a shopping cart across Canada, the second largest country in the world in terms of land mass. And we all know what a Canadian winter looks like, but he does, from pushing a shopping cart. Why did he do it? Why is he here on the Oshow? And what can we learn from him? It's such a pleasure to welcome to the program, Joe Roberts. Joe, welcome to the Oshow.
Thanks, Laura. I'm grateful to be here.
Well, I had the opportunity to listen to your formal presentation that you make, and I shouldn't really call it formal because it's very engaging, very humorous, but I got to see it at a Hope and Possibilities event that was hosted in KW in Kitchener-Waterloo to raise the alarm about homelessness and to talk about community collaboration to address the issue. And I found your story moving because you approach it from a perspective of understanding the root causes of homelessness, understanding what the experience is like and what the possibilities are. So before we get into your story and how we can all be like Gus, which is now a motto in our family, I wanted to ask you, can you just explain, as you did at the conference, Joe, the difference between the way we normally process and think about problems, our natural instinct to do it, and then what possibility thinking is? Because I think that's a good way to set the plate for our conversation.
Yeah, I like to think through possibility. Like when you look at me today, I don't look anything like that guy who was disheveled, pushing a shopping cart, struggling with substance use disorder and mental health. But inside me was that possibility. When we deal with a crisis, challenge, and change like homelessness, the mental health crisis, and all the other things that are sort of busting loose the last 5 years, not just in Canada, throughout North America and the Western world, we are confronted with the way we process and see potential. because we're driving from a limbic system brain. And so we weigh our own efforts or our own ability to create change in our lives, in our businesses, in our families, our communities, based on past evidence, current capability, and likelihood of success. Right? So if you've never run a marathon, there's not a high likelihood that you can run a marathon in 3 months. Because you haven't done it before, you don't have the capabilities, so you don't really see yourself being able to do that. Well, the same is the problem. When you look at municipalities that didn't have this problem before, that are now having to make the shift, that becomes problematic. So possibility is looking at ourselves, looking at the world, and saying, or looking at others and saying, what could be? It's empathic, it's curious, it's imaginative. And possibility is what creates all human innovation and all social change. It's the thing that we admire in Terry Fox and Nelson Mandela. Possibility is looking at the world and saying, where could we be a year from now, 5 years, 10 years from now? Instead of asking the question, what if we fail? What if we succeed? When we enter into possibility, we begin to engage our brains and these different ways of neural pathways up here into this prefrontal cortex, and we create something new. And the evidence of possibility is all around us. It's in the iPhone that's sitting in front of us. It's in the car we drove, that was once in the mind of Henry Ford, the airplanes that was once in the mind of the Wright brothers. So when we look at big social change, it's imperative that we look through the lens of something else and create a new potential and possibility. But that's really difficult to do when when we're confronted with a lot of these things that are scary and different and challenging, because it forces us to have the discipline to see something else that's difficult to see. But again, going back to that example, I was that guy, and somebody saw a possibility in me and invested in that, and then drew that potential up and out of me.
Well, and we'll talk about Gus as we get through your conversation. But for people who have just listened to you, obviously you're highly educated, right? I believe you have an honorary doctorate, don't you? And you found out, as you told us, that when you did end up in school later, finishing your education, you found out you were wicked smart, was, I think, the way that you addressed it. But that was
wicked smart. Wicked smart.
I can't quite do justice. But that was a revelation for you, because even though, and I'd love for you to share a bit of your background, even though your father in your early childhood gave you the sense you could do anything, you had other influences in your teen years that suggested that you were limited. And that limited thinking, that limited potential for yourself led you to some very dangerous and despairing places. And so could you share with our audience briefly, and I know I'm asking you to kind of crush down what you do in an hour with your live audiences, but could you just sort of give us a sense of those milestones in your childhood and how they ended up having you in a park in Vancouver living in homelessness with addiction?
Sure. So I'm this painfully average Canadian, came from Midland, Ontario, an hour north of Toronto. Dad worked at the local seatbelt factory. First 8 years of my life, it was, it was like a sitcom. It was just perfect. Dad was this great guy. He used to say to us kids, I love you. You can do and be anything. In his shadow, I felt loved, safe, and protected. Mom was a homemaker. She had some part-time jobs, but she wasn't fully employed. And unfortunately, in 1975, Dad passed away suddenly. So all of a sudden, our family takes this hard right turn. We're now experiencing poverty, and there's a lot of scary stuff going on. And mom's alone. And so within a relatively short period of time, she remarries. It was really more about economics. The problem is that the person who then would replace my father wasn't anything like he was a complete polar opposite. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic. So I went from a dad who would say, I love you, you can do and be anything, to a man who would say, you're stupid, you're dumb, and you'll never amount to anything. So at a very young age, I had this early childhood trauma and grief of losing my father, and this ongoing verbal, mental, and emotional abuse from my stepfather. And the thing that I talk a lot about, especially when I speak to young people, is that if you can get a kid to believe a lie about who they are, you can hide their possibility and predict some of their poor choices. At 9 years old, an opportunity to use drugs happened. I chose. And what happened in that process is that I didn't do it because I was curious about drug consumption. I did it because I wanted to belong. But then something magical happened. for the first time since my dad died, I felt safe. And so it was a place that I went to for the next 15 years of my life. When I talk to people about what happened during COVID, what did you use to get by? Was it food? Was it social media? Was it streaming? Because all of us had our own little flavor. Now, maybe you did something good. You went to yoga, you exercised, you talked to your friend, you picked up music, you gardened, whatever. But a lot of us picked choices and weren't necessarily, but that's what we do as human beings, right? So under the influence, I felt safe and protected. But as life sort of went on, as serious consequences started to unfold in my life. By the time I was 15, I got kicked out of the house. 16, I got kicked out of school. And 17, I was involved with the criminal justice system. And I decided to leave that small town, as many kids do. They leave their little community and they come. It'll be different when I go to Toronto or Winnipeg or Edmonton or Thunder Bay. And I jumped on that bus and I went out to Vancouver. And within 3 weeks, I landed on the streets. And as the weeks and months progressed, I ended up being that kid who pushed a shopping cart. And the funny thing is, inside me was all of this potential. You talked about graduating and being successful in school. I had a story in my head that I wasn't smart, and so I never gave myself the effort to try anything because I'd already made the decision. And yeah, so that was me. I'm sitting on a park bench. I was fortunate enough to sit down one day beside this guy named Gus, and I remember he looked at me and he said, "There's more to you, Joe, than you can see." And at the time, I was this dirty, disheveled kid who collected cans and bottles to support an opioid dependency. But for the first time in my life, someone other than my mom or my dad spoke to my possibility. Now, the next day, something else happened. I walked into a center that's very similar to some of the ones that, Tara will talk about shortly. And those people then connected me with my mom, got me the resources I need. I entered into detox and then a full-time residential treatment program. I went back to school. I graduated with honors. I went out in the business world. And in less than 12 years, I went from pushing a shopping cart to being the Canadian version of the American dream. Now, and I say this often, I wasn't special. I just had access to the right resources. When you take a look at the work that Melanie Redmond and Dr. Stephen Gates are doing in Away Home Canada about making the shift, it's about taking a look at how can we invest better resources so that young people don't end up spinning out and landing on the street. Get them the stuff they need, whether it's mental health, emergency housing, support for trauma, so that they get the best opportunity to transition safely and become their possibility.
There were two little anecdotes that you told during your speech the other day that really stuck with me. One was the moment when you described what it is to have an opioid addiction. And I was sharing this with my family when you said it's like the worst flu you've ever had times 100. And that $10 can stop it, right? Just getting another hit can stop those horrible symptoms that we all dread when we have the flu. And so you made a decision, if you could share that story. And then I have one other one I want to talk about your mom. But if you could share what that moment was like for you and when you touched the pavement.
Yeah. So on my worst day, I was that guy who was sort of really trapped in that vicious cycle of substance use disorder. And my drug of choice was opiates. And opiates, regardless of whether it's fentanyl or heroin or Oxycontin, they're all the same. They do the same thing to the body. And when you begin to withdraw, the body rebels. And it is like that. The feeling I can describe to somebody who's never experienced that, it is like the flu, except it magnifies. So hot and cold sweats, upset stomach, pounding headache. And I was experiencing that 3 days before Christmas on a park bench in Vancouver, rocking back and forth. And then it starts to rain. And I'm sitting there, in this red checkered lumber jacket, wondering, how am I going to get $10? I didn't want to rob or steal because that's not who I was. I came up with what I thought was a good idea. And I walked into the pub across the street and I sold the only item I had left in the world that was worth $10. And that was the boots off my feet. And I'll never forget the feeling of the cold concrete when I stepped outside of that bar. And I felt complete hopelessness. And I was in so much pain and I felt so alone in the world. And I couldn't imagine getting through another day. And I believe that for me, that's sort of when the miracle happened. I became willing to do something different. I reached out, I said a little prayer, I asked for help. And I made a promise on that street corner that if I got a second chance, I wouldn't waste it and I would do something to pay it forward. The next day is when I walked into that resource center, very similar to the ones that Tara will talk about. And they hooked me up with my mom, and mom took me in, flew out to Vancouver and brought me back to Ontario, where all of the good stuff started to happen.
Can you share what the guy at the center said to you when he said, do you have family? And you said, I have my mom, but I put her through enough. I don't want to call it. What he said to you. I love that.
Yeah. Well, what happened was I walked into this Frontline resource center. I think it was the Salvation Army, and there was a guy there. And after lunch, he took me back. First of all, he got me a pair of shoes, and then he took me back into his office. And what he was doing with me is he was doing an asset inventory. Who is in your life? Because he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I think I want to change. Like I'm willing to do." And he said, "Okay." So who do you know? Who do you know locally? And mom came up on the list. He said, "Well, let's call your mom in Ontario." And I said, "I don't want to call mom. I'd called mom so many times to bail me out of so many problems, and I was so ashamed." And he said to me, he says, "Moms don't give up that easy." And yeah, mom, and that's the thing is mom jumped on a plane, flew out to Vancouver, scooped me up off the street. And if it wasn't for mom and that guy and, Gus and, some of these other folks, I don't know where I'd be today. I'm lucky that I had that mom who wouldn't quit, but not everybody has that mom. And that's why it's so important to support organizations like Tara's, because they are, the surrogate moms out there that are helping and supporting our community's most vulnerable people.
I love that you say that, moms and dads and Gus's, all of the people, the surrogates, everybody who is out there supporting. And just as we wrap up here, you went across Canada to raise awareness. I love the point that you said, you walked how many thousands of steps? Was it 11? I forget how many thousand.
11,375,000. Well, I got to the place where I was successful in business, but then I wanted to pay back on that promise. And so pushing the shopping cart across Canada was an opportunity to engage in so many hundreds of organizations, law enforcement, government at all levels. Mm-hmm. And the shopping cart was that symbol of homelessness. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, we between 2016 and 17, I walked 9,064 kilometers, 11 million steps. But more importantly, we raised the volume on what we can do to better protect. There are three windows upon which we can look through homelessness. One is the window of compassion. As lived experience, I cannot help but see it through that we owe it to shore up our social contract and support vulnerable people. But maybe you don't share that. Maybe homelessness has impacted your business or something. So let's look through the second window, which is the window of pragmatism, right? That it's imperative for us to do this as a nation to reduce the stress on emergency services, healthcare, police, fire, ambulance, courts. We have to do this because it's either pay me now or pay me later. It's going to come out of our social coffers. And the third window is the window of indifference. And the work that I try to do as an advocate to collapse the stigma, to just share my vulnerable story, is to try and eliminate that window and say, look, I don't care which side of this, whether you're conservative or whether you've got a liberal perspective of this. Let's just find the common ground and try to do something to support vulnerable people.
Well, you said it so beautifully, and to be like Gus, you said when people ask you what you can do for homeless, should it be a sandwich or some cash? And you say, talk to them, right? To have that conversation, to look into their eyes, and to be like Gus was, to see their possibilities. It resonated with me deeply, and I'm sure with our Oshow audience. And I love the way that you're educating people to see the possibilities, whether it is pragmatism or compassion. But what we don't want is to have an indifference towards it, because you didn't get to the economics of it too much. But the reality is that's taking pressure off of all of those first responders and resources. But we're seeing the problem of homelessness and precarious housing growing exponentially, and the cost that there is going to be on the system, and the cost of people's lives is going to hit us all in the pocketbook. Just for people who just want to look at the hard, cold bottom line, right? This is something that we have to invest in the solution and invest in the people. And so we'll get to Tara now, and I'll talk to her about some of those policy recommendations and community collaborative efforts that have been making a difference, because there is hope. There is hope when we approach this from not a probabilities perspective, but a possibilities perspective. But I thank you for being here today and giving us a summary, a short little version of some of your story, because I think that helps people to look at individuals experiencing homelessness differently, to maybe, instead of just not looking because it's too hard to see, or not looking because we have our stigmas or whatever else going on with ourselves, but to actually see them as the individuals that they are, to have met you now and to know Joe, and to say, hey, wait a second, am I seeing the possibilities here? Am I part of the solution, or am I hiding indifferently from the problem and from what my neighbors need? So thank you so much, Joe Roberts. And I think you're out of the Vancouver area based on our time zone here. But I know that you do a fabulous job, even over Zoom, for groups. And I encourage anyone listening in the Oshow audience or watching to see whether or not Joe might be a fit for whoever you're working with, or whatever you're working on, because he certainly made an impact with us at the Hope and Possibilities Conference. Thank you so much, Joe Roberts.
You're very kind. Thanks, Laura. Thanks for having us on the program.
I'm so pleased to have joining us here on the pod, Tara Groves-Taylor. She is the CEO of Community Health Caring, located in one of the fastest growing municipalities in the country. So she and her team are on the front lines of what is happening in terms of homelessness in Canada. And Tara, it's so great to have you on the Oshow.
Thanks so much for having me, Laura. I'm so pleased to be on the Oshow, and I'm honored to be sharing this Oshow with Joe Roberts, someone who's so inspirational and resonates so much with myself and with all of our staff at Community Healthcare in Kitchener-Waterloo.
Tara, what do people need to understand first and foremost on the issue identification side of this crisis in our country? How bad is it? What is fueling it? Like, what does it look like for your team, who are every single day going out and trying to serve the most vulnerable, like tens of thousands of them just in Kitchener-Waterloo alone?
It's such a complex and complicated issue. And I mean, our mighty team of 16 folks that has actually grown from 6 to 16 in the past year with our community partners are at 22 different locations that represent either homelessness or precarious housing. So it includes encampments, it includes shelters, it includes transitional housing and supportive housing. And as you said, our visits have tripled over the past year, and the unique individuals that we serve, which I think is a very interesting number, has more than doubled in one calendar year. We are in a homelessness crisis, and the beds are shrinking, not growing. And the beds are shrinking predominantly faster for people who are already on the margins and are being pushed further to the margins. The homelessness crisis is complicated because it involves so much more than just homelessness. The folks that we are seeing in crisis shelters are very, very ill. And they're not ill with one thing. They're ill with a lot of different things, whether it be mental health, whether it be chronic disease, and then add in drug addiction, because we have stats that indicate more than 87% of folks who are currently in our shelter system are also addicted to drugs. So it's complicated. And then you add into that the fact that our fastest growing homeless population is divided between seniors over 55 and I'll pause for a moment to know how shocking that is, as well as refugees. Refugees coming to our community, which is supposed to be a welcoming community that has housing for them and healthcare and supports. We don't have housing, healthcare, and supports for people who were already residing in our community, let alone immigrants who are coming with the promise of those things available to them. So it's very frustrating. It's very complicated. And so, you know, there's a lot of plans to end chronic homelessness, and there's a lot of rapid housing initiatives, and there's a lot of different initiatives right now that are trying to tackle the problem and have the best intentions. I think what people have to understand is that housing stability is not about four walls and a roof. Housing stability is about the supports that people need to be successful to not only move into housing, but to stay in housing. That requires primary care. It requires social supports. It requires mental health and addictions, and it requires a sense of belonging and a sense of community. And I think that is the piece that we are trying desperately to drive home at the regional level, at the provincial level, at the federal level, to say it's not okay to solve certain aspects of the housing crisis and not address the other aspects of the housing crisis, because you will never, ever solve it. If you don't look at all of it, you will never solve it. And our folks that serve these people know this firsthand. They stay with these individuals, whether they're in a tent, on the side of the road, in a shelter, as they move through transitional housing, as they get a supportive housing bed, if that happens, because it's so rare and there are so few units. And then they're there if it doesn't work, and they end up back on the street and back in the tent, because they are the stability that stays with that person, that that person trusts. And so that is what we are imploring our funders and our influencers to do, is to see that that is the solution to homelessness, creating stability, creating sense of community, sense of belonging, and having the supports that are necessary.
As I understand it, Tara, there is a correlation between the heat and living in the heat and the toll it takes on everybody. But if you're using, as part of the opioid crisis we have in this country, it exacerbates how those drugs toxify in your system, and it's led, has it not, to more deaths in your region?
Oh, it has. We had an OMERS alert, which is an overdose alert, go out 2 days ago because there were 5 overdoses in a very short span of time after the heat wave started. It's complex in that you're talking about dehydration, no stable funding, no access, regular access to a food source. And then you're talking about trying to ask your body to regulate itself physiologically while you're also poisoning it with a toxic drug substance. So all of those things create an unfortunate environment for people to overdose. And if they're not in a safe space, if they're not being observed, if they're not, in a safe use location, then unfortunately no one's there to reverse it. And it's only going to worsen because we're predicting a pretty hot summer, and we have a very toxic drug supply. So it's unpredictable at the best of times and changes every single week with the, how it's made and how unstable it is. A growing unwillingness to look at safe supply. All of these things are contributing to the current crisis that we see. And, it's also, we're getting to a point where it's one size fits all. So a lot of the shelters that are closing in Kitchener-Waterloo, so we have a women's specific shelter that's closing in Waterloo, or closed actually. We have another one that's slated for closure that's co-ed. But it's absolutely a crisis shelter for the most difficult to serve, the most complex. One of them closed last month. Another one is closing in March. The current language that's being used in regards to shelters coming online and beds to replace those shelter beds is how do I put it? There's a lot of barriers, right? And so what we know about this population is that when you create a space with a lot of barriers and a lot of expectations, like sign a contract and stay clean, it's really not going to work. If you look at the fact that most people who are addicted to a substance and want to address their addiction take 7 or more times to actually be successful, there's no way you're forcing someone into addiction recovery. And, we had an opportunity to participate in a neighborhood meeting last night in regards to the crisis shelter that's slated for closure in March. And it was a meeting with a group of neighbors from that community who are very, very, very upset about the shelter being in their backyard, their language. And I understand that. I really do. I understand that. There's a lot of 911 calls. There's a lot of needles. There's a lot of drug use. Not necessarily what you would anticipate wanting to have in your neighborhood and with your children. I think what struck me more, though, was the lack of grace and humanity in some of the conversations. I don't know when we got to a point in our society that people were disposable. And that's the kind of conversations that are happening right now, is that, either take them to jail, take them to rehab, or, just let them die in the gutter because they're not going to help themselves anyways. And that is shocking. It's shocking to me. While I understand it's frustrating and I understand it's difficult to have in your neighborhood, those are humans. Those are someone's brother. Those are someone's sister. That's someone's father. And yes, we don't understand fully the series of events that got them into that place. But if you listen to someone like Joe Roberts, I think you start to have a little bit more understanding about what gets you into those places, the kind of trauma that you experience, the lack of community. And I'm going to tell you, in society today, many of us are 1 or 2 paychecks away from potentially being homeless and potentially experiencing that kind of despair and trauma. And so while it's easy to judge when we sit in stability and community and support and love, not so much when it changes. And I think that's what breaks my heart more than anything on a daily basis, is we don't have the same level of humanness that we previously had. And that's a crisis too. And I think for us to solve the homelessness problem is going to take a heck of a lot of work, because there's so many other variables that are playing into it.
Is the ask of politicians and government at all levels? What is it that would best help organizations like yours who are doing the heavy lifting across Canada?
That's a great question. In Kitchener-Waterloo, we are one of the fastest growing communities in the province. They're projecting exponential growth between now and 2028. And they're also predicting a 227% increase in refugees to our community over the coming 3.5, 4 years. So, if we're in crisis now, I don't think anything's going to be rapid enough from a housing initiative perspective to address the needs in our community. They do have some innovation. The plan to end chronic homelessness was a fairly consultative, collaborative initiative in our community. However, it still didn't address the gaps for folks that face the most barriers, the most marginalization. So while there may be a solution for people who are stable enough to move into these funding options, and who, are going to get to a place or are in a place where they can advocate potentially for themselves or learn to advocate for themselves, that will work. But only addressing those aspects of the homeless in our community will not address the issues that are the most concerning in our community. So if you look at that community meeting, the folks that they're talking about, the folks that they're complaining about, will not be addressed in any of the current initiatives for housing, right? They won't. And so That's the conversation that needs to happen. And the problem is the disconnect between the federal government and the provincial government and the region, frankly, right? So if you're getting money coming in and your incentives are for housing initiatives and building and all of those sort of things, you're not paying attention to the fact that the supports you need in the community to be successful in those housing initiatives, whether you're homeless or not, do not exist. We have over 60,000 people in Kitchener-Waterloo who have no primary care attachment. Those are not homeless people. Those are every people, right? So our hospitals are burgeoning, the emergency rooms cannot handle it. There's waits of 10 to 12 hours, people who are actually not being seen at all. So every part of our community is being impacted. The food bank can't keep up. Our pay what you can, take what you need market, it's cleared within an hour of the shelves being filled every day. We cannot keep up with donations. We have a breakfast club that is growing week by week by week in attendees for people who are facing food insecurity. So we all have to come together and we have to be innovative. We can't keep going off in the corner and solving these bits and pieces of the problem and not doing it together. And I think that is my biggest ask, right? If you're building housing, if you're building a housing continuum, which is what you need, because people want a sense of community. So it's one thing if you've got scattered housing units, supportive housing units around the community, but someone who lived in their transitional housing with their community, and then you're saying, great job, move 5 bus rides away to that apartment building where you will be completely isolated and be successful. It's not going to work. So we have to start changing the way we look at housing. We have to build communities where there are different housing options based on what your needs are at that time. And healthcare and social supports and mental health and addictions have to be in those spaces. And there has to be enough of them to serve the people that are there. That's when you will start to see change. That's when I see hope for ending homelessness, is if we start to look at things in a very different way than we look at them now.
When you care about current affairs, it's on the Oshow. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the Oshow. If you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the Oshow. It's the Oshow. Laura Babcock's the Oshow. With a lot of great guests, she puts them to the test on the Oshow. There's no doubt they'll be calling them out on the Oshow. Stand for something or fall for it all. Ontario, hear the call of the Oshow. It's a podcast, the Oshow. Laura Babcock's the Oshow. Stay informed with the Oshow, Oshow.
Your merch bid.